We'll move quickly now. Our next speaker, the Honorable Buck McKeon. You have his biography. I promised a brief introduction with something that you don't know. So one of the great debates is exercise of hard power versus soft power. Representative McKeon's district had the heights of both of these. On the hard power side, the Palmdale Skunk Works plant, which produced the SR-71, the stealth bomber, is in his district. But on the soft power side, if you remember the Chevy Chase movie National Lampoon's Vacation, Wally World, where Chevy Chase and John Candy rode the roller coasters, that was filmed in his district as well. So he encompasses it all. Representative McKeon.
Okay, just sit here.
Yes, sir.
Is this on?
Yes, sir.
Also, we had the highest spot in the lowest 48 states, Mount Whitney, and we had the lowest spot, Death Valley. So that's our claim to fame. I'm going to take a whole different subject here. I see it says the U.S. President, U.S. Arab relations. I'm going to talk a little bit about politics. I'm going to tell you who's going to be the next president. No, let's take a poll. We hear a lot about polls. That sounds great. No, I'm convinced that the next president will be Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Ask me to stand up. Okay. I was tired of sitting anyway, so that works out fine. In 9 or 13 days, we will have an election. Some people have already voted. We're in early voting. Most of us, I think, are so fed up with it that we can't wait for it to be over. But we will elect a president who will be the president for the next 4 years at least. We will elect a Senate, at least a third of the Senate. And there's possibility of a change in control of the Senate, and we will elect the whole House of Representatives, and they will be in charge for the next 2 years. I'd like to talk a little bit about each of these. The president first. There's, if you look at the media, you see a lot of talk about, some of them say it's already over, that Hillary's won and it's already decided. I've been a student of polls now for a number of years since I got into politics, and it's really interesting. One thing I have enjoyed this year is watching the geniuses that watched the debates and then afterwards told us, well, Mr. Trump will be gone this week, for sure. Next week, the same thing. He'll be gone this week for sure. Nobody can say anything about Senator McKeon like that and last. He's gone this week. So I've pretty well determined that the geniuses don't know a thing. And it's been around for a long time. Eric Cantor was our leader when I was in the House, and he was leading by 20 or 30 points until he lost. And that was, I remember the next morning, that was the biggest shock. Nobody could believe it, because everybody in politics lives by those polls. I remember as a young man watching President Truman the night after his defeat when he held up the newspaper showing that Dewey had won. But then when they finished the count, actually, he had won. I know President Carter in the election when he was running against President Reagan. He also had won. 4 or 5 days out from the election, he was 9 points up. And actually, the election was such a landslide the other way that guys like me in California watched that it was determined before we even closed the polls out in California. So I just think nobody knows at this point who's going to be the next president of the United States. We do know, whoever it is, they're going to have a huge job. Let me talk a little bit about the Senate. The Republicans have 54 seats. There's a lot of talk about them losing the control. What that means in the control is the party in control names all the chairmen, they set the agenda, they determine what the Senate's going to do. The minority is just kind of there. So if the Republicans lose 4 seats, they could lose control of the Senate. They could lose 5 seats, and they definitely would lose control of the Senate. For the Democrats to gain control, they would have to win 4 seats and the White House, and then the Vice President would break the tie. I recently spoke to Senator Heller in Nevada and Joe Heck, who's running for the Senate in Nevada. That's a seat that a Republican could pick up, which would make a change in the whole dynamics, and that is very, very close either way. In the House, the Democrats need to pick up 30 seats. That's very remote. In a landslide by Hillary Clinton, it could possibly happen, but that's one thing that, of all of these other predictions, is very, very remote. Then once the election's over, and let me just say, there will be a peaceful, orderly transition of our government, whoever wins the election. Whatever anybody else has said, that you can plan on. But that will happen after the results are finalized. Many of the districts in the House won't be decided the first night. There are generally some challenges, but it's a handful of seats that may take up to a month or 2 or even more to decide, but they will not have a big difference in deciding the final result of which party controls. And again, I remember when George Bush was elected. It took us a few months of counting Chads and a few things before it was finally determined that Bush was the president. Kennedy and Nixon, there was a fight, and finally Nixon said, it's not worth tearing the country apart. I support President Kennedy. He won. That's how our country functions, and that's how we work things. Most of the Senate and House seats will be settled by the day after the election. We'll know who they're elected. The other ones, as I said, a possibility a couple could take a few months. The control of the Senate pretty much will be known in those first few days. But when the next Congress reconvenes on January 3rd, let's say the Republicans are in charge by 1 seat. And let's say Senator Inhofe won in Georgia. Chad Pergram from Fox News wrote an article a while back laying out this scenario. Inhofe wins, but in Georgia there are 3 people running, and you have to win the race. You have to win 50% or more. Very hard to do that when you've got 3 people running. So say Inhofe wins, but they have a runoff. Well, the Congress meets on the 3rd. Say the Republicans are winners by 1 seat, and there's a runoff in Georgia, and Senator Isaacson loses the runoff. It could change. So there are going to be some interesting things to be watching. The House comes back into session November 14th, the week after the election. The first item on their agenda will be leadership elections. The majority of the conference will elect who the speaker, who the majority leader, and on down the line. They do that within their conference, and then they move forward. There's some work to finish up. Does that mean I'm 2 minutes over or 2 minutes left? 2 minutes left. Okay. They select the speaker that week, the week of after the election of November 14th. Then there's a lot of business that needs to be accomplished. We, as you know, are functioning right now on a continuing resolution. A budget wasn't passed, so we don't know what's going to happen on December 9th about passing some kind of legislation that will allow the government to function for the next year. We don't know what's going to happen with the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that right now is waiting for a conference report. So there's still a lot of business to happen in November and December while they're tussling over these other things. And then when the House reconvenes on January 3rd, there will be an election held, and they pick the speaker. And at that point, you have to have 218 votes. There's a little problem with that. So there's lots of things to keep watching on the political front. It's going to be an exciting few years. Thank you.
Admiral John Miller has commanded naval aviation and ships, to include the Dubuque, Juneau, Constellation, and John F. Kennedy. He's also been the commander of the 5th Fleet, which has generally 3 combined joint standing task forces, and is probably vying with the NATO commander for the most operational multinational controls of any American. But of particular note, he's also responsible for the Department of Defense Dependent School in Bahrain, as commander of the 5th Fleet, which he formerly was, which has graduated more Gulf Arabs than have been awarded Fulbright scholarships. So again, both elements of power, hard and soft, and I should note that the Crown Prince of Bahrain is a graduate of his school. So Admiral Miller.
Thanks, David. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. If you take President Roosevelt's meeting with King Abdulaziz in the Great Bitter Lake in the Suez Canal in 1945, that's sort of your starting off point. Defense cooperation with the Arabs and the United States is really a pretty rich topic. So I've taken a bit of an appetite suppressant, and I'm going to really concentrate on cooperation between the GCC and the United States and talk to that. It's a good story, and it's really more in my wheelhouse. NAVCENT, the naval component for CENTCOM, excuse me, conducts on average about 25 exercises per year, including the International Mine Countermeasure Exercise, which is the largest exercise of its kind in the world. In fact, if you look at exercises in terms of the number of nations that participate, it's the largest naval exercise in the world. If you look at how an exercise is constructed, there's a number of different events, and if you conduct 25 exercises in a year, that means that every working day at NAVCENT is an exercise planning day. So it's quite an effort. If you look at what CENTCOM does writ large, they conduct about 50 exercises, actually a little bit north of 50 exercises per year, which means that in some component headquarters for CENTCOM, every single day of every year, there's exercise planning going on. And if you look at what that really means, exercises are really the foundation of defense cooperation, and so it's quite a robust effort. And when you consider the fact that this sort of an exercise pace and exercise schedule is going on while there are actual combat operations happening in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, it's quite an extraordinary achievement, and it's quite an extraordinary commitment on the part of the GCC, on the part of really all of CENTCOM partners, and on the part of the United States. But you don't exercise just for exercise sake. You exercise so that you're able and ready to go to combat when you need to. So how did that manifest itself? Well, back in September of 2014, the CENTCOM commander decided that it would be a good idea to have a show of force up in Syria. And so we went to our GCC partners and we said we would like to have a GCC strike into Syria against ISIL. And we'd like to do it right now. And so on a very short timeline, we put together a strike. And this is really the test of our exercise and engagement program over the last several years. 5 of the 6 GCC nations participated. We had one nation that needed to refresh their tanker quals. And when I say a very short timeline, I'm talking about a 48-hour timeline. And so the tanker quals were refreshed. That country conducted the longest range airstrike that it had ever conducted. And all of the airplanes that participated in the strike that dropped bombs, and all the airplanes that intended to drop bombs did drop bombs, and they all hit their targets. And there was no rehearsal. Everybody got airborne, rendezvoused, flew up to the targets, engaged their targets, hit their targets, and safely returned to base. That's what a robust exercise program can do for you. That's what interoperability does for you. And so that says a lot about our program. It's been popular lately around town to ask the question, are our GCC partners, or writ larger, are our Arab partners pulling their load? Are they doing their fair share? Just last week, General Votel, the CENTCOM commander, was in town talking to one of the local think tanks, and someone asked him that question. He really couldn't have been more clear when he said, and I'll try to quote him, basically said, we could not do the things that we're doing in the region were it not for the efforts of Bahrain. That's a kind of an extraordinary statement. So when you think about the AOR, north to south from Kazakhstan down to Kenya, east to west from Pakistan to Egypt, it's northwards of 20 countries. It's 2.5 million square miles of ocean. It's a pretty big AOR. So you've got little Bahrain kind of in the center of that. And the CENTCOM commander says, hey, we can't do the things that we're doing in the region if it were not for Bahrain. What does Bahrain do? Well, they're obviously the host of NAV-sent U.S. Fifth Fleet. They're also a major logistics hub. They allow us access to an air base, and they do a number of other things for us. But they're committed to our success. And then there are a number of other countries that do things that don't always get into the news, but they're important to us nonetheless. There's a bombing range up in Kuwait, Udara bombing range, that both the Navy and the Air Force routinely have access to. In Qatar, we have LUD Air Base, which is the home for the CENTAF Forward Headquarters, as well as the CENTCOM Forward Headquarters. In the UAE, we have access to bases where we fly aircraft out of for combat operations. We also have access to Jebel Ali, which is a major logistics hub for us, as well as a place for our ships to pull into port for maintenance and for liberty. And in Oman, they're building a facility. It's already open for use, but it continues to expand in support of Duqm on the Indian Ocean. It's large enough to take nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines, and in fact has already done so. So all around the region, we are working closely with our GCC partners on defense cooperation activities. And so if anybody wonders, are they pulling their load, you don't have to ask me. You don't have to look at all the things that I just laid out. You simply have to ask the Central Command Commander, who was adamant that, in fact, they are pulling their load. I'd like to take a little look at a little bit of recent history, and it's an American look, so it goes all the way back to 2013. We call that history. And really, it starts with Secretary Hagel and some remarks he made at the Manama Dialogue in 2013. He had what was really a rather novel idea of saying, hey, the Department of Defense is going to try to deal less with individual GCC nations and deal more with the GCC as a whole. It's a novel idea. It's a great idea. So many of us wish he would have talked to us about it first, because it's harder to do than it sounds, because the GCC as an organization is well suited to deal foreign ministry to foreign ministry, not so well suited to deal DOD to GCC. So it caused us to do quite a bit of work. So what followed after that in the springtime, in May of 2014 in Riyadh, was one of the defense ministerials that the Secretary talked about. And what we had decided in the interim was we were going to concentrate on three things, one of which he talked about, two of which he did not. One was cyber. We were going to work on cyber defense collectively, and the other two were integrated air and missile defense and maritime security. And so subsequent work continued, and we worked hard together to understand how we could work together, GCC to DOD. And what came out of that, in the fall of 2014, we became aware of the fact that the GCC was standing up Maritime Task Force 8-1 in honor of the year that the GCC was formed. And that task force was going to work with Fifth Fleet Task Force 152, which is the Maritime Task Force responsible for maritime security within the Arabian Gulf. And what also came out of that was the fact that the exercises that the Air Force and the Navy routinely conducted, integrated air and missile defense exercises that we conducted together, would become available as combined exercises, and we would begin to bring the GCC units into that story. And so those are both pretty good success stories. And they really flowed out of the initiative from the Manama Dialogue in December of 2013. Of course, we continue to remain committed to all three of those original lines of effort, and we continue to work on a number of additional other things as well. What also came out of that were the two summits that we had, one in April of 2015 and the other one in May of 2016. And those are the Camp David Summit and the Riyadh Summit, which were natural outflows from this Manama Dialogue followed by the defense ministerials that were occurred at the head of state levels. So all of those initiatives are evidence of continued cooperation between the U.S. and Arab states, and in particular the GCC. What also came out of that is the fact that in between those two head of state meetings, between the U.S. and the GCC states, we inked $30 billion in weapons sales. And one of the things you have to ask yourself is, what does that really mean? It can perhaps mean one of two things. We're highly interested in interoperability because this is a commitment on the part of the U.S. to sell a great deal of weapon systems to the GCC states and for them to buy it. Or it could mean that we're preparing them to be able to operate on their own because we're going to become less engaged in the region. I think it remains unclear which of those two signals we're getting ready to send, and I think it's a point that we should continue to debate. From my standpoint, it's an excellent case for interoperability, and we see that demonstrated these days on a fairly routine basis. What also didn't happen at those two head of state meetings, those two events in April 2015 and May of 2016, is the fact that there were no real security guarantees. And one of the things I think the next administration is going to have to look closely at is, should we begin to think about real security guarantees between the United States and the GCC? And I'll leave it there.
There's one issue that everybody in the world has an opinion about, that's counterterrorism, and there are two organizations that everybody thinks should do something about it. One is Saudi Arabia, the other is the United Nations. So we're honored to have a Saudi who works on the United Nations counterterrorism program, Mr. Nawaf Al-Thawri.
Thank you, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, good afternoon. It's no secret that the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia share many common interests and have enjoyed a prosperous alliance dating back to the Second World War. Providing Saudi Arabia with adequate defense, be it direct or indirect, it has always been a high priority item for the United States. In the last 8 years, the United States has sold around $115 billion in arms to the Kingdom, creating and maintaining around 160,000 jobs in the United States, and in essence, enhancing economic development and defense for both countries. While 2003 marked the end of the United States military operations in Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom since then has improved its intelligence cooperation with the United States, which remains indispensable as it has helped thwart a number of terrorist attacks over a span of that time. The U.S. State Department stated in a report released last year that the Kingdom maintains a robust counterterrorism relationship with the United States. The exposed terror plot of October 2010 is a prime example. 2 plastic explosives hidden in the printer cartridges were discovered on board cargo planes that had left Yemen destined for Chicago. They were intercepted by U.S. forces in time to foil the terror plot and avert certain tragedy. That interception was the result of Saudi intelligence acting in cooperation with U.S. Homeland Security. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has always recognized that the fight against terrorism is a global one that requires cooperation and coordination amongst nations. In February 2005, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia hosted the first International Counterterrorism Conference in Riyadh, at which the late custodian of the 2 holy mosques, King Abdullah Al Saud, called upon the international community to establish an international center to fight terrorism. Fast forward 6 years later, the United Nations Counterterrorism Center was established. It was established to promote international counterterrorism cooperation and support UN member states in the implementation of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy. Since its inception, the United Nations Counterterrorism Center has been the UN's main capacity building arm, helping to develop regional and national counterterrorism strategies in areas most vulnerable. training border security officials, and dealing with apprehended terrorists directly. These projects are approved by an advisory board comprising of 21 member states, including the United States, and is led by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The center epitomizes global unity in the fight against terrorism and violent extremism, and as a growing entity, has yet to realize its full potential. In addition to leading an all-Muslim military coalition aimed at combating terror, Saudi Arabia is one of the 60-plus nations comprising the U.S.-led coalition against the so-called Islamic State. Saudi Arabia is primarily contributing through air combat and has taken part in recent airstrikes in Syria. The United States has cooperated in the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen against the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, which have extended their threat by conducting 2 separate missile attacks on U.S. Navy ships in recent days. In retaliation, the U.S. launched its first strike on Houthi-controlled territory. These recent events show that the immediate threat posed by proxies of the world's leading sponsor of terrorism requires an anti-terror alliance as formidable as that the U.S.-Saudi one has proven to be over the years. Speaking of Iranian proxies, the U.S. Treasury Department and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are teaming up to target Lebanese nationals who helped fund and plan Hezbollah terror operations. A few days ago, acting Treasury Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, Adam Zubin, stated, "Today's joint action with Saudi Arabia underscores the strength of U.S. and Saudi cooperation in disrupting Hezbollah's worldwide commercial and financial infrastructure. The joint counterterror finance operation is a clear indicator of how both countries view the threat posed by Iranian-linked militias. Indeed, since 9/11, Saudi Arabia has used every resource available to lead in this fight, protect its people, and lend support to the international community. The kingdom has been an integral part of this endeavor for over 2 decades, contributing millions of dollars to the cause, and in many cases, spearheading initiatives such as the United Nations Counterterrorism Center that have created enduring measures to overcome radicalized insurgents. Having said that, allow me to address the 900-pound elephant in the room. There is a growing degree of frustration in the United States, which has led to the rise of some strange and interesting phenomena characterized by a deep lack of foresight. As a counterterrorism expert, I'll address the one closest to my area of expertise, and that is the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, or JASTA in short. The law effectively lifts the kingdom's sovereign immunity to accommodate federal lawsuits against the Saudi government by the families of victims of the horrendous attacks of 9/11. Legislation that has passed despite the rigorous investigations which have exonerated the involvement of the kingdom's government in those horrible attacks. The ramifications are dark and profound. It is indeed a shame, considering the integral role that the Saudi Arabian government plays in combating terrorism alongside the United States. Terrorists are terrorists. Their national identities are irrelevant and drowned by their affiliation to a poisonous ideology. They have threatened and continue to threaten Saudi national security. His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal put it best when he said, "It is like victimizing the victims of terrorism." Nevertheless, the 7-year-old Saudi-U.S. alliance, solidified by FDR's visit to King Abdulaziz in 1945, is a robust and resilient one which has withstood both the 1973 oil embargo and the wave of anti-Saudi sentiments following the 9/11 attacks. When it comes to assessing the damage JASTA will have on U.S.-Saudi ties, I will always reference my Foreign Minister, Adil Al-Jubair. When asked by the Post last year, he said, "When push comes to shove, this relationship is unshakable." Thank you very much.
Finally, our final panelist this morning is a Washington institution, a man who has produced books too numerous to mention, and who produces a quarterly slide or a periodic slide deck on Gulf security that is breathtaking in its comprehensiveness. And I have to warn you, a friend of mine downloaded it on his smartphone when he was traveling outside of the country and got $32 worth of excess data charges, roaming charges. So it was with great pleasure that our final panelist, Dr. Tony Cordesman.
First, let me ask where my royalties are. I think we have already heard some of the challenges to the next administration in security cooperation. I'd like to take a few moments to address some of the ones which are a little less familiar, but which the next president and indeed the next Congress is also going to have to face. One of them is that there is no such thing as security without stability. And as we look across the MENA area, I think what you see is on the civil side, in terms of politics, demographics, corruption, the quality of governance, all of the problems which led to the uprisings in 2011 have for many countries gotten steadily worse. Only a few countries have actually moved toward meaningful reform. For every Saudi 2030 vision plan, however practical or impractical it may be, you have country after country which effectively has taken no organized approach to the problem other than trying to improve its internal security. No matter what we do in security cooperation, we cannot solve these problems at a purely military level. At this level of counterterrorism, I think the U.S. and Europe in particular have focused far too much on ISIS. If you use the START database, which is a database the State Department uses in its terrorism report, ISIS was responsible for all of about 38% of the terrorist acts in the MENA region last year. Once ISIS is gone, there is not going to be an end to extremism or terrorism. You may actually see a rise in terrorism. You may also see, depending on how active these movements are, a growth in sectarian and ethnic fighting and violence at a different level. Finding solutions to those ethnic and sectarian problems require as much cooperation between the United States and the Gulf states as any aspect of the military dimension. Finding a smooth relationship, as Prince Turki has said, between the United States and the West and the Muslim world is equally important. Let me give you two figures from a Pew Trust study of what is happening in Islam. And this is Islam on a global basis, not just the Middle East. The Pew Trust found that Islam was growing as a religion with affiliates at twice the rate of Christianity and Hinduism. It projected an increase of 1.6 billion Muslims in the period between 2010 and 2050. And most of that increase will not be in the Middle East, but the areas around it. If we cannot find a way to match counterterrorism with dealing with the broader problems of countering extremism, of helping our Arab and Islamic allies, counterterrorism is inherently incapable of dealing with these forces. We have already seen in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and possibly Libya, a civil military tragedy. The question now is, what can the next administration and the Arab states do to deal with this tragedy? Because it will not be a matter of solving it in military terms. It has to be addressed in economic and political terms as well. And here again, let's put terrorism back in perspective. Terrorism may be somewhere between a third or ISIS may be somewhere between a third and 40% of the casualties. ISIS, if you take into account the Syrian regime, Russia, and other fighting, is about 7% of the actual casualties. These are being generated by war in a much more conventional sense of civil conflict. And these are areas which also have to be addressed in security cooperation. I am not sure how we address this, but I am sure that we will have to. And we have two choices. We can try to do it better, or we can continue to do it badly. And let me say here that there is a tendency to blame the United States. I think a lot of that is justified. But quite frankly, when I look at far too much of the Arab world, I see three exports. One is petroleum, the third is conspiracy theories, and the most important one is responsibility. And every time I hear that the United States should do it from someone in the Arab world, my response is, quite frankly, why the hell haven't you? This is something that I think we are going to have to change in security cooperation. Now, the burden sharing issue has already been addressed, but let me just very quickly give you a few figures. Last year, Saudi Arabia spent some $82 billion on security, according to the International Institute of Strategic Studies. How do I put that figure in perspective? It's the third highest military budget in the world. Ranks after about $600 billion for us and $146 billion for China. It was higher than $66 billion for Russia, $56 billion for the UK, and $46 billion for India. The UK spent over $14 billion. Virtually all of the countries in the Gulf spent far more of their gross domestic product on defense than the United States. And the United States spends approximately twice as much as most of our European allies. When we talk about burdens, you have to keep that in perspective. You've already heard about defense cooperation from the Admiral. According to the figures in a Congressional Research Service study, the GCC placed about $86 billion worth of arms orders between 2007 and 2014. Iran placed less than $1 billion. That is an incredible disparity. And the question is, how wise was it, how well organized, and how well structured was the spending? But let me give you another figure, using a somewhat different definition. Our Defense Cooperation Security Agency doesn't define arms sales the right way. But according to the Gulf Cooperation Council spent $110 billion on new arms agreements with the United States between 2006 and 2015. That's the most recent decade. It took only $31 billion in deliveries. Saudi Arabia alone ordered $67 billion worth of new arms. Seen from a selfish American perspective, that is an almost incredible investment in interoperability and in the ability to support American power projection. It is something which is of immense strategic value to the United States if we can find a way to sustain it, if we do not bog down in debates over whether those arms can be released, regardless of whether they have a military impact in Yemen. But there's been a 50% cut in petroleum revenues. We're talking about a Saudi expenditure of nearly 13% of the Saudi gross domestic product. You are talking about Oman spending 16% of its GDP on defense. This is not burden sharing. This is unsustainable. We cannot basically ignore the realities of defense and military spending in the Gulf. We cannot look at arms transfers regardless of their civil and economic impact. And if I was to point out one of the greatest weaknesses in the 2030 vision of Saudi Arabia, it exists in an intellectual vacuum. It addresses only the civil side of the economy, and it creates a fantasy of having a massive Saudi defense industry in spite of all the lessons of the past as to how wasteful and destructive this can be. And that brings me to my final point. We cannot go on with things like the Manama dialogue NATO has vacuous enough ministerial statements. The ASEAN alliance manages to list, year by year, the same pointless list of agreed statements that meet a non-alliance. We need specific plans. We need mission-oriented programs. We need to look at how you can actually integrate U.S. efforts, those of Britain and France, and those of the Arab states. We cannot have a situation in parallel where state after state buys weapons the way an American male in a midlife crisis buys a sports car. The flashiest, most pointless toy you can get, regardless of its meaning. Now that sounds facetious till you look at the new order list and the lack of coordination. There are things that are real challenges here. They require us to act as allies, and they require an approach which looks forward and toward real effectiveness in the broad sense of counterterrorism, deterrence, and military operations. And let's be blunt about it. We do not have that structure today, and issuing pointless Manama dialogue statements and ministerial agreements is not going to help.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cordesman. And we have a limited amount of time for questioning. Your remarks reminded me my Porsche is double parked out front, and I believe I left my toupee in it. Do you have questions, or shall I read them, or shall you?
I can read them because I have read them.
Okay.
I can see the handwriting. Question for any of the speakers, panelists. There is an argument that Iran, with its current aggression, is nothing but a cornered cat, counterattacking. How true is this? Is Iran smaller than it's actually presented itself, and throwing rocks right and left to distract its weakness, external as well as from within? If true, why not contain it? And if true, who should be the bigger country to try to start a dialogue with Iran, the GCC, the United States, or should we expect Iran itself to start such a meaningful dialogue? Anybody?
Let's have Dr. Cordesman and then Admiral Miller take that one.
All right.
First, I think we are looking at an Iran which reacted to the nuclear agreement by making major shifts in its missile and rocket and cruise missile program. A very serious increase in those, is seeking to give them precision strike capability, and precision strike capability in a region where energy plants, desalination plants, and power plants create a major structure of vulnerability. You're watching a steady build-up in its ability to conduct an asymmetric war in the Gulf and outside it. I'd prefer to leave that to the Admiral, but I think it's a key point.
I didn't quite hear. Can you repeat it, please?
Asymmetric, the vulnerability asymmetric war in light of Iranian development precision strike.
There's a third issue which I think is equally critical, which is its ability to penetrate into the military structures of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, potentially into Yemen, although, quite frankly, the Houthi are often given the blame for the Saleh military, and I am not quite sure that the Iranians are quite as effective as some countries claim. This is not an empty military power. Any analysis of the military balance, of its procurement and its action show this. It does require containment and deterrence, but as it adapts, so must the United States and its Arab allies. I think when it comes down to dialogue, we have two, or really three choices. If you have no dialogue, you have no real hope. If your dialogue is too optimistic and based on false optimism, you are going to have a dialogue that doesn't matter. Your third choice is to keep trying to have an effective dialogue regardless of the hardline approaches taken by the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards. Sooner or later, you have to assume that deterrence and dialogue are a far better option than warfighting.
Admiral?
First of all, I will tell you I agree with everything that Dr. Cordesman said, and then a couple other points to add for that. One of the things I think is important to remember is before the ink was dry on the JCPOA agreement, the Iranian foreign minister was in Moscow sealing the deal for the delivery of the S-300 missile system. That would be the first upgrade to a major Iranian weapon system since the revolution, and not an insignificant accomplishment. And they're also interested in getting some other things, specifically the Su-30 aircraft and the Count Coastal Defense Cruise Missile System, which would allow them to range the entire Gulf. And so not only, as Dr. Cordesman said, are they interested in continuing to improve their asymmetric warfare capabilities and their precision for their ballistic missiles, but now they're interested in making improvements to their more conventional weapon systems so that they can get a little bit more parity with the people on the other side of the Gulf with the GCC. The second point I'd like to make is what we're seeing them do is what they've always done and what we can expect them to do. So while the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was a good deal because it at least slows down the development of a nuclear weapon, you still have Iran to deal with, and so we cannot be surprised that they're acting in the way that they're continuing to act. So I think we can expect them to continue to act that way. And I'll give you one specific, and then we'll move on to the next question. We read specifically last month of an increase in the number of incidents where they harass, we'll say, U.S. naval shipping, where they get closer than they should, and the number of incidents are higher than they were last year. Maybe not drastically higher, as is reported in the press, but a little bit higher. And so the U.S. Navy has a series of measures that they go through to warn off this kind of behavior. And that behavior didn't really stop until we got to a point where one of our ships fired warning shots. And we've only had one incident since then. And so that's not untypical of the Iranians. Well, they will press that envelope and press that envelope, and they'll see just how far they can go until they get a reaction that's as much as they can tolerate. And I'm not surprised by that, and it's not unexpected. And in terms of dialogue, there have been a number of occasions in our history where the U.S. has tried to initiate that dialogue and not found that to be fruitful. So I don't think that they're willing to necessarily engage in dialogue. And as long as they're a country where their constitution makes them honor bound to export the revolution, I don't think that's going to change.
Well, I apologize for my mismanagement of the panel. We're not able to take more questions. But let's hear it for the panelists here.